He served as Grand Rapids Calvary Church pastor for 18 years. Then he was diagnosed with ALS, more commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. A man of faith facing death, now reevaluating Christianity and the meaning of life. We discuss with Reverend Ed Dobson on Newsmakers.
I would say that as a pastor, I love everything. I love teaching, I love weddings, I love baptisms, I even love board meetings. In college, I wanted to be a surgeon, but halfway through, God spoke to me about being a pastor. And so I switched from chemistry to Bible. Everything I did as a pastor, I felt I was doing what God called me to do. I knew that ALS would force me to quit. And I knew ultimately it would take my voice. So I told God, if you take my voice, it's okay with me. I ended up continuing as a pastor for 5 years, and the head of the clinic where I went told me, look, you need to quit as soon as possible. So I came back that weekend and announced I was quitting. It felt like all of a sudden life had come to an end. Life was over. It's going from 100 miles an hour to 0 overnight.
That was a clip from Reverend Ed Dobson's film, My Garden. It's one of 5 films spun from his 2007 book, Prayers and Promises When Facing a Life-Threatening Illness. Ed Dobson is here to discuss some of his life's lessons in dealing with its ultimate ending. Much of it you learned as you have battled ALS. That clip really gut-wrenching, and dealing with being told that you're dying. How do you process that emotionally, and what are those feelings? What do you recommend to people who have been presented with that same ultimate chapter?
Wow, that's a tough question.
You're the man with the answers.
For me, being told I had ALS was like sinking into darkness, or a fog rolled in on my life where I couldn't see, I couldn't get perspective. And it lasted several months until I began coming out of it.
For you, a man of faith, I think most people would think, well, you would turn to the Bible, you would turn to prayer.
Mm-hmm.
What really happens when you're faced with?
Well, I had always said if I knew I was dying, I'd really read the Bible, and I couldn't. I thought if I was dying, I would really begin to pray, and I couldn't pray. I think your circumstances overwhelm your sense of purpose and identity.
So you have to take a step back. I mean, you leave the church, and you talked about that sense of identity. For most people, what it is that you do in life is how you somehow characterize yourself and makes you a fulfilled person. Did you go through that too? That
Oh,
now
yeah.
what?
Yeah. Up until I left, if someone had asked me, where is your identity? My identity is in Christ, and I'm not into what I do. But then I left, and I realized how much my identity was wrapped up in what I did.
Because there you are, Sundays, probably other days of the week, preparing sermons, getting in front of 5,000 at your church. There's a real sense that people need you. How do you fill that void?
It's in part that people need me, but it's also in part what I do in contributing to their lives. And the next day, I have a study away from the church, and I went to the study, and I had nothing to do. No books to read, no sermon to study, nothing. And I sat there all day figuring out what in the world am I going to do.
And yet now facing death, and you have lived much longer than doctors had estimated. When I watch these films, and just knowing what little I know of you, it seems like you're on this much more noble cause now. Knowing that you're dying, which, as you have said in one of the documentaries, one of the films, you're okay with death, but it's the dying part that's horrible. But here you are, where people are turning to you. There are others with ALS who are traveling into Grand Rapids to meet with you. I mean, it's amazing how you've turned it on its head.
I hope I've turned it on its head. I still miss preaching. I still miss teaching. I still miss the 5,000 people I influenced. I'm learning that one-on-one is just as important as 5,000. But I would underline, I'm learning. I haven't quite got there yet.
Do you take away more, though, on the one-on-one? Do you find out more about a person?
Oh, yeah.
What they truly need?
Yeah, absolutely. You take away more, and I am as encouraged as the person I'm meeting with.
Yeah, how has it helped you?
Listening to the stories of people encourages me.
What I think is the most beautiful part of all of this, as I travel my spiritual journey in life, is that you had this opportunity now to live 1 year like Christ. How do you do that?
Wow. Well,
you wrote a book on it.
Yeah, yeah. I tried to live Jewishly, which meant I ate kosher, went to the synagogue, observed the feasts and festivals. Secondly, I listened to the Gospels every week. And then thirdly, I tried to obey what Jesus said as literally as possible. And at the end of the year, living like Jesus is tough business.
Can you describe it?
Not in a few words. I felt overwhelmed. I felt at the end of the year, I was just beginning to understand Jesus.
Did you, I mean, you know, the idea of Christ and his teachings was that it was the people in most need that you meet in life. You know, how dare you talk with the tax collectors? How dare you talk with the prostitute? However, is that the path you took? Did you talk with those types of people?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a friend who's in a punk band who met Jesus, so he wrote a song where Jesus is a friend of the poor and needy and the rich and greedy. And I kind of like that. Jesus is into people no matter where they are in life.
I'm fascinated that you went to the synagogue,
Yeah.
and to kind of refresh yourself with everything. And yet Jews don't believe that Christ is the Son of God. So how were you able to reconcile that as you're, going through the rituals of feasts and everything else and learning from those who aren't believers?
I have a rabbi that helped me think through what it meant to live like Jesus. And we met many times during the year, and I attended his synagogue. And we obviously disagree on Jesus, but I found powerful what I learned at the synagogue.
And when you talk about those disagreements, there are many religions that have those disagreements. How do we as humans from all faiths reconcile those differences?
Ultimately, I don't think you can. For me, Jesus is the way to God. For Jews, he's not the way to God. And ultimately, I leave that all up to God.
So you'll know when we get there, is that?
Yeah. Taking the Bible seriously, I think it's Jesus. But I leave it up to God who's in and who's out.
And then after finishing that year of living a life of Christ, what did you take away from that? I mean, how powerful was that for you emotionally, physically, spiritually?
It was good for me. I lost my identity as a pastor, so I was figuring out what's my purpose. And for a whole year, I got up every day, not worried about the disease, but focusing on Jesus and his teaching.
What do you tell people? I mean, as you face death, and everybody faces death, really. Mm-hmm. Some people are told, hey, you have so much time to live, and others, it can happen tomorrow. You could live a full life and die. We're all going to meet the same ending. As a man in his mid-40s, mm-hmm. you start to think about life. You're kind of at the halftime of life. Mm-hmm. What have you found? What is, in essence, what is life about for you?
Wow. I wasn't anticipating that question. For me, there's a transcendence to life. There's something more than being married, having kids, doing a job. There's something spiritual about life. And for me, it's believing and following Jesus' teachings. That's the ultimate purpose for why I'm here.
Because we were all created, is that part of it? There is a purpose in that creation?
Yeah. The Hebrew scriptures begin, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So we'd do well to pay attention to the one who created us.
Our general manager here had jaw cancer, mm-hmm. and has been through the treatments, and he's got a clean bill of health now. Mm-hmm. I had lunch with him not too long ago and talked with him about much of what he experienced. And in the end, I asked him the same question. I said, now that you've gone through all of this, facing death, what did you learn? And it was quite simply, he said, it ain't about the stuff. It's about the relationships. It's about your family. Are you finding a lot of that also to be true?
Oh, absolutely. People ask me, now that you know you're dying, I bet you think a lot about heaven. I said, not really. I found out how attached I am to my wife, my kids, my grandkids, the people around me. And ultimately, for example, when I left Calvary, I walked out on thousands of people. Only my family walked out with me. In the end, it's the family that matters.
When you leave, have you been back to the church, or is it too difficult to go back?
No, I do go back.
Talking about family, and that's what matters, I'm always fascinated by forgiveness. And if you want to check it out, edstory.com, there are a number of clips from the different films here. I want to show the trailer from Forgiveness.
I sat down one day and wrote a list of everybody I knew I had offended. And I began working my way through the list. I think forgiveness is a great idea until you have someone to forgive. And then it's very difficult. You have to humble yourself. You have to admit you were wrong. You have to look at the person in the eyeballs, and all of that's intimidating.
You mentioned in that clip consequences to choices. And forgiveness does not overrule the consequences, but it is the right thing to do. When you look at forgiveness and the consequences, is there a belief from people, well, if I forgive, then all is forgiven? Is that when you get into the consequences of it?
No, not really. I made a list. Since I knew I was going to die, I made a list, several pages worth, of people I knew I had offended. And I went to each of them and asked forgiveness. And for me, it liberated me. It set me free. What it did for them is up to them.
Did anybody say no? I'm not forgiving you, Ed?
No, one person said, well, I have a Christian obligation to forgive you. And I thought, oh no, now I have to forgive him again.
Did you work it out?
Yeah, oh yeah.
I'm sure that really sparked a much better conversation, a more meaningful conversation.
Well, yeah, maybe.
But when it comes to forgiveness, it's not an easy thing for people to do. You can make that list, but why is that so difficult for people?
I think because we think we're right and everybody else is wrong. So asking forgiveness acknowledges that we had part of the broken relationship. And that's hard to admit that.
You mentioned the consequences. Is there a case where there are certain sins that cannot be forgiven?
Not that I know of.
But in the end, there will be the ultimate decision of whether or not you're forgiven.
Yeah, Jesus said we are to forgive others as God has forgiven us. And he implies if you're unwilling to forgive others, God is unwilling to forgive you, which lays a little bit of guilt on the whole subject.
And then, of course, the other area that I love to explore is worry. And another one of the films is called Consider the Birds, and of course that comes from Matthew. But along the way of life, I mean, we worry about so many things. It's just like it's a built-in device. We worry about things. What if, looking back, were there certain things you said, why did I worry about that?
Well, I still worry. I think we all do because we're human. For me, my worry was about the future. And I would take a 5-minute time out and repeat a verse from the Bible over and over and over again.
Is that a soothing thing to do and
Yeah.
to understand it?
Yeah, it's part prayer, part reminding yourself, and part quoting scripture.
How important is it that every day people take time to pray or to read something that's spiritual?
I think it's critical. It acknowledges there's more to life than me. It acknowledges the priority of God. It acknowledges our dependence on God.
I had the opportunity to talk with my father. He's now 79, but he came to visit last spring. And I think, any son, any daughter, there's always that question of how are my parents as they age? How are they dealing with getting closer to death? And it was hard to bring up, but I asked him about it, and I could sense he was apprehensive and scared. And his concern was, well, I just don't know if God is a compassionate God or a God that is a personal God. As you contemplate all this, what do you tell people as they process all of life and facing death?
Basically, Patrick, I tell them my own story. How when I was 11 in Ireland, I accepted the Lord, and I've tried to follow him all my life. And basically, I say, this is my story.
And so most people also should find that relationship.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
It's not always an easy journey for people. Why can religion be so difficult for people? Is it because there's something that's real here that we all face, and it's not always easy to understand the spiritual?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Everybody comes to you for the answers. I feel like I'm blessed to be sitting here and have the opportunity. But there is something about being in your shoes. I mean, you have placed yourself in a seat where people come to you for answers. Did you ever think that this would be where you're sitting today, with so many people coming to you?
No, not really. When I was at Calvary Church, people came to me for answers. Now, when they come, I do more listening than I do talking.
What are the skills when it comes to listening? Not everybody's a very good listener. What do you tell people when it comes to listening?
You ask questions, and then you shut up.
And you know what? I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to thank you for being here, Reverend
You're
Ed
welcome.
Dobson. Thank you so much. And the website is edstory.com, and you can go there, and there are some of the books if you'd like to explore more of your spiritual faith, and also those documentaries are also available. Reverend Ed Dobson, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Every human being knows they're going to die. The difference is I feel it with every twitch in my muscles. I feel it in the depths of my being.
Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
I had considered my life as over, but it wasn't. I didn't expect another Christmas. The doctors gave me 2 to 5 years. That was over 10 years ago.